Some people out there like to vehemently deny the reality that gender as a theme is extremely important within the realms of FromSoft. Trust me when I say that, because my comment sections have been filled with disbelievers who enjoy thoroughly insulting the concept and thoroughly insulting me. Even in Bloodborne, to some, this theme is simply delusion on our part. And yes, I am quite delusional, but today I present to you my smoking gun, Gwyndolin. Alright, let's slow it down to my usual pace. I just thought I'd try be a little exciting for once. Gender, as I've talked about often on the channel, has a clear place within FromSoft. I've covered Bloodborne as a whole and the queens in Dark Souls 2, but today I want to look specifically at gender fluidity and non-conformity within all three entries in the Dark Souls series. Despite this being a more closer analysis of gender instead of a broad stroke, there's still a lot to explore, and if you enjoy it, subscribe. It helps me a lot and helps me keep making these analytical ramblings. But anyway, let's break down the topic game by game and see how gender fluidity exists in Dark Souls, starting with, of course, the first game. The themes surrounding gender are clearly present in the first game, though in a far rougher form. They're more focused in on in the sequels, and of course FromSoft's other games, but the existence of Gwyndolin this early on shows that the devs do want to approach gender and consider the subject's depth. Let's start by going over his general story. In Dark Souls 1, Gwyndolin is the only god remaining in Anor Londo. The rest have either fled or hollowed away. He remains even until Dark Souls 3, where we see he has been eaten or is in the process of being eaten by Aldrich, though by this time he had restored Anor Londo to glory and become the leader at some point in between games. And yes, I will be referring to him with masculine pronouns simply because the game does. Priscilla is assumed to be his mother, as in Dark Souls 3 we meet Yorshka, who calls Gwyndolin her older brother, but they have different fathers, as Gwyndolin is referred to as Gwyn's youngest child. And Yorshka is clearly linked to Priscilla visually. It's clear that the two are supposed to be related in some way or another. Other evidence for Gwyndolin and Priscilla's relationship is the fact Aldrich acquires Priscilla's life hunt scythe from eating Gwyndolin and promptly dreaming of Yorshka, and also the fact his legs are made up of snakes, which are imperfect dragons in this world. This also means he's a crossbreed like Priscilla, and it means Guinevere is his half-sister on Gwyn's side, whilst Yorshka is his half-sister on Priscilla's side. And as a side note, it's not clear who Guinevere and the Nameless King's mother was, but we can assume it wasn't Priscilla, as Yorshka doesn't mention them, nor do they appear as crossbreeds. They're also officially heralded in statues, so we can assume that they came from official, by-the-books marriages that the public approved of. Now onto the main part we're interested in today. As told to us by the reversal ring, Gwyndolin was raised as a girl by his father Gwyn. There are a few reasons we can posit for this, and we'll start with the first, the fact that the child had an affinity for the moon, a feminine form of magic in Dark Souls. Let's discuss that briefly. Magic in general is linked with femininity because miracles are associated with masculinity due to Gwyn's usage of them. The patriarch and god of Dark Souls was a powerful miracle wielder, thus lightning and miracles became associated with masculine power, though this isn't particularly strict. It only gets that way when we consider moon magic. Because, as we see throughout the games, men can freely use and explore magic. In fact, Seath is the grandfather of magic, and men like Orbeck in Dark Souls 3 are free to study it. But when it comes to dark moon magic, a focus is put on femininity, and within the games, it's used primarily by women or feminine individuals, not counting the player. We can also assume this is due to the moon's historical association with femininity throughout mythologies and histories, and the sun's association with masculinity. Thus, when Gwyndolin was born and showed an affinity for the moon, it must have been a deciding factor in raising him as a girl, as such magic is powerful but locked behind gendered doors. But another more compelling theory regarding Gwyn's decision to raise his son as a daughter comes through the concept of inheritance. It's been theorized that a major reason why Gwyn raised Gwyndolin as a girl was to prevent him having access to the throne, especially after the Nameless King was expelled, because that would have meant Gwyndolin was next in line. Gwyn is clearly inspired by Zeus, and it can be safe to assume that, like Zeus, he was a huge fan of affairs. Not only then did Gwyndolin come from an affair with Priscilla, but he was born with a connection to the moon and as a crossbreed, both factors considered shameful by the family and by society, despite them being no fault of the child's. So not only would Gwyn want to avoid the child assuming the throne and thus providing power to Priscilla's side of the family, he would also want to hide his unmasculine crossbreed child from the world. Instead, as the older sister, Guinevere would be first in line for the throne, which could cause some issues, as historically women have had limitations when becoming queen, if it was allowed at all, but it would certainly portray a better and more holy image for the beautiful princess to be on the throne, not her part dragon, sickly brother/sister who was born from an affair. It seems to have been in many ways a political decision, but knowing what we know about Gwyn, it wouldn't surprise me if he had a real distaste for his youngest. And that's a really miserable thought, as we know Gwyndolin admired his father and the rule of the sun. We see from this story that even if unintentional, an interesting and resonant image of gender was painted when the devs created Gwyndolin. There's no real way to label and categorize this character, because Gwyndolin is still referred to as son and as brother. Despite the failings of his masculinity in the eyes of his father, everyone else, even history, viewed through item descriptions, considers Gwyndolin a son. And yet, Gwyndolin has breasts when we meet him, and he himself, not through speech nor item descriptions, has anything to say about his own identity. I think we can assume that regardless of what his father wanted, Gwyndolin found some kind of peace with himself. To be regarded as a son and brother is no problem to him, and neither is his proficiency in feminine magic or the feminine body he resides in. His character is such an interesting commentary on categorization, how he was forced into boxes from a young age, but still came out as a mixture of traits and roles, still came out as someone who cannot be categorized, and still came out as a leader despite everything being against him. He defies every expectation and feels no need to label himself, because it seems he's found some sense in the lack of sense. And it's even more interesting to me that the fandom has had an obsession with Gwendolin's identity since day one, particularly in trying to label him a man and a victim of some terrible gender tragedy. And maybe I'm contributing to that subject right now in some ways, but my conclusion on Gwyndolin is not a label, nor a celebration, nor a condemnation. I'm instead committing to an optimistic exploration of the character. I think his story is a very interesting exploration of gender roles, how they can be forced on us, and how we can find space within them. They can mould us, but we can also mould them, as Gwyndolin did, finding a space between femininity and the masculine leadership role he eventually took up. Despite what some people conclude, I don't think there's any real kind of gender tragedy here. Gwyn forcing Gwyndolin into a feminine role isn't a great thing to do, but I consider his shunning and indoctrination the worst actions, because those are what would really hurt you as a child. I think for a lot of men, having their masculinity denied to them would be horrible, so I get why this story is viewed by some as a gender tragedy of sorts. But Gwyndolin found peace with his identity, and was able to become ruler of Anor Londo by the Lothric era. The real tragedy is that even when ruling, Gwyndolin was not fully accepted. The statues of him in Irithyll cover his face and legs, and I think that's telling. And his final reward for upholding a system that hated him was being eaten alive by Aldrich. There was no final acceptance, and no real change to the status quo. He was born opposing the reign of the sun, born into the realm of the moon, and shunned because of that. Yet, he made it his life's duty to uphold the Age of the Flame. It must be said that despite the fact I've presented Gwyndolin as a victim, he is not entirely that. He is a victim of this system, and it's sad knowing he had to hide himself even when in power, but we have to consider the reality that he upheld this system that put him down. The Darkmoon Knight's primary goal was to attack people who went against the gods' interests, and by becoming the ruler of Anor Londo, Gwyndolin was upholding the rule of the gods, the rule of the flame. Though I don't personally think he deserved to be eaten alive, maybe with more time he would have founded some Age of the Moon like Rani. Maybe under said moon his non-conformity would have been fully embraced. But that's wishful thinking because I like his character. He is a fantastically confusing look at gender, and a very nuanced character in general. For the rest of the game, not a lot can be said about gender fluidity, as gender roles were pretty rigid within the society of Dark Souls 1, as I covered briefly in this video. I think the Darkmoon Knightess can be looked at somewhat, not in terms of gender identity per se, but gender performance, because she defies the expectation of what Firekeepers should be, that is, being traditionally feminine. She, instead, takes on a lot of masculine roles by being a knight and one of the last remaining sane guardians in Anor Londo. It's also worth mentioning the impact of deformity on gender performance in this reality, and our own too. If your body doesn't suit the standard of your sex, you have to hide it or hide yourself. Gwyndolin is hidden away in Anor Londo due to his body, and the Darkmoon Knightess is described as having a hideous appearance. She thus hides her body beneath perfect, shining armour, and from this, we can see the impact society has on the way your gendered performance will play out. This is a bit of an aside, but it's an important concept to understand if you want to comprehend gender theory and maybe understand yourself a bit more as well. The whole concept of internal versus external influence especially applies to cis people who are against or confused by so-called gender ideology, because you too engage with it every day, and you have since the day you were born. You may not believe in the intricacies of internal mechanisms that make someone like Gwendolyn choose to be non-conforming, but you can't deny the external pressures placed on you by society that make you want to conform to gender expectations. On that note, another thing I've always appreciated about the knights in Dark Souls is their gender-neutral or fluid presentation. There are many examples from many games where armoured individuals will have clear physical differentiations depending on gender. But if we look at the knight enemies in Dark Souls, specifically Dark Souls 1, then no such differentiation exists. The Silver Knights, for example, are all humanoid, but they aren't made different by the exposure of their midriffs or something equally absurd. Same for the Sentinels and the Stone Knights. The Painting Guardians do have different models, but their attire is the same, presenting them as one fluid army, not an army of differing genders and classes. And yes, there are plenty of examples of strict gender roles or armor changing depending on your character's gender, but today we're focusing on examples of gender fluidity. If you're enjoying so far, please do subscribe and leave a comment letting me know your thoughts on the subject so far. But that's all I have to say for the first game, so let's move on to the greatest game of all time, Dark Souls 2. Darkness and the abyss in Dark Souls is a natural force, just as natural as the flame, but due to the flame's unnatural continuation, the abyss has mutated, become a force we can all recognise as malign. Not evil per se, but corrupting and uncontrollable. The same would happen to the flame if the cycle was instead in favour of darkness. And the abyss is where we came from. It's labelled the mother of all. And yet, the most powerful creature in the abyss was labelled father of the abyss. So we already have some strange gendered messaging here. On one hand, the abyss is the mother we all came from, and on the other, the icon of the abyss, its earthly manifestation, is the father. But it goes further. When Manus was defeated, his soul split into 4 known parts, and those parts found form and became the queens we meet in Dark Souls 2. The abyss is both mother and father, feminine and masculine, but somehow one singular force. It cannot be neatly split into our human categories of gender, nor can its offspring. Yet, for some reason, we force strict labels onto each other that were never present in the churning abyss we all came from, maybe to make sense of it, and to make sense of ourselves. I already covered the queens in the video I mentioned earlier, so I won't rehash it here. If you're interested in the subject, then go watch that one. But besides the abyss and the queens, there are a few other presentations of gender fluidity within this game. Exhibit A, the Lost Sinner. I've seen a lot of people be surprised at the fact the Lost Sinner is explicitly described as a woman in her item descriptions. She appears to be a parallel to the witches of Izalith, theorised to have tried to recreate the flame in Ilium Lois due to her connection to the Chaos Bug and her missing eye, as we find a priestess eye in the DLC. The gender fluidity in her story comes from her appearance when we see her, and this appearance is why many don't realise she's a woman, because she has a beard. I was a bit stumped on how to interpret this, besides the fact in our culture, women having facial hair is extremely frowned upon. I don't know if you guys remember that viral post about Aloy having peach fuzz, but yeah, if women aren't allowed to have this, then the Lost Sinner is really breaking some boundaries. But the way I came to see it is, the state in which we find her suggests gender is a completely meaningless concept for her. She has been reduced to a prisoner in chains guarding her own twisted soul. She's no priestess nor a feminine entity as we would interpret, just a prisoner. To adhere to gendered expectations in this situation would be laughable, actually. Imagine her dressed in Monster Hunter gear or something. It would completely ruin the image. I also think her presentation in comparison to the Witches of Izalith is interesting. Despite the sisters we see in Dark Souls 1 having sinned in the same way and been thusly corrupted by the chaos, they instead became mythological creatures with beautiful and untouched upper bodies. This is also whilst their brother became this monster. And I haven't made a video about this yet, but there is a lot you can criticise about how gender is presented in Dark Souls 1. Whilst they do have a lot of interesting commentary and positive messages, there's still a lot of weird objectification and application of tradition. But the commentary definitely improved throughout the series, and we see better presentations in the sequel. Instead of becoming a beautiful spider creature, the Lost Sinner's meddling with the chaos removed her from our categories entirely. She became first and foremost a prisoner and a punished sinner. Her gender is now completely irrelevant and thus a neutral or fluid force. So when we look at it like that, I can see why the devs used female pronouns but presented her with a beard and a mask, instead of as a beautiful but corrupted creature of chaos. To finish off this section, let's cover a theory I've become rather fond of. The Ivory King may have actually been of female sex. If this is true, who knows what their actual gender identity is, that's for you to decide. But as per all these points, we're exploring the subjects as genderqueer in some way, something akin to fluidity or neutrality. The helmet of the Ivory King specifically points out that he hid his countenance, his face, from his people. You could shrug this off as meaningless, but in storytelling, every word and every decision is purposeful and has meaning. So why exactly do we need to be specifically told that the king hid his face, especially when no statement is made about the other kings in the story? But that isn't anything extremely substantial. The strongest piece of evidence comes from the fact his armor set gives a buff to female wearers. If you've chosen that sex for your character, then you'll receive a buff from the set, but if your character is male, no such buff will apply. And with the help of a trusty coffin, you can see this in action. This is obviously strange because why would a presumed male be wearing an armor set that provides a buff to the opposite sex? It makes absolutely zero sense. And alongside the specific message of the king hiding his face, I think we've got a case here. But of course, you could argue that the king hid his face because he was humble and didn't want to bring attention to himself as an individual. As for the armor buff, you could argue it was a developer oversight or a bug or something similar. But labeling the king as either woman or man is not the point of this video and not something I'm extremely interested in. I'm interested in the possibility that he could have been female or some form of gender fluid. I think it would be a very compelling story that the only truly good king in this game, maybe even the franchise, did not adhere to the strict expectations of gender. And not only that, he treated his queen as an equal and served his kingdom as equally as they served him. It makes sense to me that someone like that would also not care for gendered expectations, whether that means he was a woman or maybe even trans, which is also a fun possibility. Pick whichever headcanon you like, and if you want to think of him as just a strong, straight man, that's fine too. The enjoyable part of lore and thematic exploration is the subjective possibility, not the objective truth. Before we move on to Dark Souls 3, I just want to say that I think the Ivory King theory is one of my favourites in the franchise, and I only heard about it recently because I guess I'm a fraud. But moving on, let's finish off the video with Dark Souls 3. I have the least to say about this game, but there's still a few interesting things to cover, namely the Soul of Cinder. This boss is the amalgamation of all the Lords of Cinder. That includes Gwyn and the Chosen Undead from Dark Souls 1. So I don't think I even have to explain how this thing represents a fluid state of gender. It's literally the combination of hundreds, if not thousands of individuals. Men, women, every soul amassed into this guardian at the centre of the earth. The spirits of eons past congregated into a fiery set of armour with one purpose and one goal. Whatever expectations the previous lords may have had cast upon them due to their gender has melted away, and now they exist as the living representation of flame. I think this boss is a great fight, and the themes and ideas you can extrapolate from it are all very compelling. The image of so many people sacrificing themselves for this idealized world, all these people throwing themselves into fire to uphold Gwyn's system of misery and subjugation, of course mirrors our own reality where we, every day, uphold the systems that harm us and the world. Alongside the other swath of pains, we uphold a billion gender expectations and criticize anyone who steps away from that set path. We lock women into secondary roles because the system says so. We force upon any gender non-conformists ostracization and even violence because the system says so. And yet, this culmination of the system, the guardian of it, presents no such difference. Another boss we can consider is the earlier mentioned Aldrich. He is consistently referred to as a man, and a horrible one at that, as we can deduce from his treatment of Rosaria and his penchants for eating people. The thing is, if we don't rise above the system, people like Aldrich do. Humans within Lordran became so complacent, so accepting of the status quo despite this status quo crumbling to pieces and subjugating us, that a successful coup was staged against Analondo by Pontiff Sullivan and then Aldrich. And the ironic thing is, Aldrich has no regard for Gwyn's system or his family. He is literally eating the old ruler. The image can't get more obvious than that. He's cannibalizing the old system to bring about his own, and so, in terms of gender, it makes sense that he has no regard for Gwyn's sensibilities. Because Aldrich doesn't really have a gender anymore, he is literally a fluid. He's a sludge monster whose only purpose is to consume and absorb and replace. A fiend just as power-hungry as Gwyn, but not nearly as shy about the fact. And this gender commentary is furthered by the fact he's eating the clearest example of gender non-conformism in the franchise. At the end of the day, it's all just flesh. Aldrich, like many we've covered in this video, has been removed from society, and thus found little use for society's rules. He lives only to consume and bring about the age of the deep, so, of course, gender would have no meaning for him. There are no strict rules and regulations and images he needs to uphold, and I like that concept. It's freeing and inviting to have no obligation to any form of gender performance, but with that ability I would, personally, not become a man-eating sludge beast, but to each their own. The last character I want to cover briefly is Anri of Astora. I'm not a huge fan of the heteronormativity mirrored onto these games, I'm sure you could have guessed that. So no, I don't like the fact she changes her sex based on your characters. Because, if you don't know, she's a romance option of sorts. She can become your partner in marriage if you pursue the Lord of Hollows ending. Marriage is a little strange in Lothric, but who am I to judge? But I do like the fact that regardless of her gender, her or his story remains the same. There are no feminine or masculine changes to the story, it plays out the exact same way, which I do appreciate. I like that she can be both and do the exact same things, and I don't think that's what they were thinking of when they changed her sex depending on yours, but the presentation remains the same. Her or his gender remains entirely cosmetic. I hope you all enjoyed this one. It was a more pointed look at an aspect of gender theory, which is definitely easier to make than a 40-minute breakdown of the entire subject. And speaking of, that's how I'm going to be approaching my Elden Ring video on gender, which I'm currently writing the script for. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's my first video to go over an hour because there is so much to break down in this game. I also want to remind people that all of my content is strictly my opinion and my interpretation. Some intellectual individuals approach my comment sections really angrily, as though I'd shared anything but a subjective opinion, so thank you to everyone who can actually comprehend the fact this is my video and not excerpts from a Dark Souls Bible. But that's not really worth complaining about because so many people have approached these videos in a kind way and actually left interesting comments instead of just being angry at something they disagreed with. So thank you to everyone who's done that. But that's all for today, so remember to subscribe, join the Discord, check out the Twitch, and support me on Ko-fi if you'd like. Thank you again, and goodbye.